there was this huge hope somehow, maybe then a change is coming super fast.
Even when we had these huge strikes with hundreds of thousands of people in different cities, the politics didn't change.
What are you going to do if they don't respond?
Climate awareness, we now know, is not enough. There's been awareness for, since 1988 in the States, since Al Gore's big movie campaign in 2006, since scientists in the 50s. Awareness denialism, I think, is no longer the main enemy of today. Today, I would say it's solutionism. I think you shouldn't really give up the strike name, even though it's not necessarily a strike, because there is another tradition of strikes that is similar to this. And here I would reference Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg had this idea from early 1900s of what she called the mass strike. So, and the workers play a key role in any transition. Right. So what would it mean to incorporate workers, right? To make not just a climate strike, but a labor strike. That to me is really the goal.
So today we're joined by Professor Jacob Blumenfeld. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Oldenburg. And he has also published, among other things, widely on questions pertaining to the climate crisis and capitalism, and also talked about climate movements in his work. Before we start, my name is Elias König, and the interview that you're listening to is part of a whole series of interviews I conducted for a research project at Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. In these interviews, I ask many amazing activists and researchers from different communities what it means for them to strike for climate justice and to share their thoughts on the future of the movement. I learned so much from these conversations, and I hope that they can be valuable to you too. If you have any thoughts, please do not hesitate to comment here or to get in touch directly. But now, without further ado, here's the episode.
So I'm Jacob Blumenfeld. I'm from the USA originally. I did my doctorate at the New School for Social Research in New York, but I've been living in Germany since 2011. I live in Berlin, but I teach at the University of Oldenburg. I'm part of a SFB kind of research center that deals with questions of property. And this research center is focused in Jena and Erfurt, actually. So I live in Berlin, I teach in Oldenburg, but I work a lot in Jena and Erfurt on questions of property and the meaning of property today. I'm a philosopher by training, like you said. I do political and social philosophy with a historical focus. And I currently I've written on climate change, on the ethics of private property, on the meaning of class, and many other topics. I'm currently working on two books. One is a historical book on the concept of property in the writings of Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, and how these German philosophers understood the role of property in creating a just economy and politics. The other book is more contemporary. It's about the idea of socialization, Vergesellschaftung, or the Sozialisierung, the socialization of property, especially in relation to land, natural resources, and industry, a topic that's become more relevant in recent years. This book project begins in the German Revolution, when the question of socialization became very heated, and it continues into the present. And there I will talk about also socialization of natural resources as one way of dealing with the climate crisis.
Right, and I'm of course most curious in this interview about your work pertaining to the climate crisis. So just out of curiosity, how did you start working on these questions of the socialization of nature? And you've also written about climate ethics. What was the kind of history of your engagement with these topics?
Politically, I've been involved in environmental and ecological struggles for 20 years, whether around, just small campaigns in the USA and New York and California over pollution or environmental racism, logging, coal mining. But the focus on climate more specifically as kind of a unifying framework is probably just since the last decade. I remember Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans really awakened my eyes to the meaning of climate change today, and the fires in California where I'm from, the continual fires and the droughts there, kind of brought it into focus. And also the writings in the last 10 years from a more critical focus on climate change really brought together not just questions of climate from a scientific point of view, but also from a political and social point of view. So I really started turning to climate ethics and climate politics more recently as an academic pursuit to understand why philosophers and other theorists who have been writing about climate a lot in the last 15 years, why they've done it in such a narrow way. Why they've done it in such a narrow way, in a way that I think is mostly irrelevant to the questions that pertain to us today. And so that was kind of my impetus to really challenge the narrowness of a lot of writings on climate that mostly just deal with how states should negotiate climate treaties, or they deal with the ethics of individual consumption, and they leave out big questions about how do you reorganize the economy, who has power to do so, why isn't there action being done, what are the causes of the climate crisis, and what does that causal story tell us about how to change it. Some of these questions are being dealt with in other fields, journalism or sociology or politics, but philosophy, which usually loves dealing with moral complexity, I thought had a very uncomplex relationship to this topic. So that's kind of got me interested, going from that political background into the more theoretical questions that climate change poses for us today.
Right. And I think the first time I heard you speak was in a symposium, I think in 2019, in the context of the climate justice mobilizations that happened in that year around the world. And I'm wondering, with your longer history of engagement, both as an activist and as an academic, how did you perceive the recent years in terms of the development of the climate justice movement, and perhaps also theories about and for the climate justice movement? Do you think they have shifted towards addressing these sorts of more relevant questions that you've mentioned? And how do you think has also the praxis of the movement changed in the last few years?
You mean are you asking me about the climate strikes of 2019?
Yes.
Mostly?
Yes.
Then? Because there's lots of different actions that can be said to relate to climate and ecology, whether it's pipeline struggles or people defending against highways being built, or people trying to take down or stop coal plants at very different levels of society, right? From grassroots to political. So there's all different ways of aspects that people discuss climate. And the climate strike was kind of this signal, I think, to the world that it's not just isolated issues. There's a general problem, a generational problem in a sense. So I think, that was an incredibly important wave of mobilization. And not to be underestimated is its role in mobilizing people and in bringing awareness to tons of youth, connecting them to each other and showing them that these issues are not going to be dealt with by politicians on their own, by the adults in the room, that these are questions that have been ignored or delayed for decades. So it's really a wake-up call to many people when millions of people started coming out into the streets, demanding action. Now, I think, however, we should have a critical look on these movements. I think it's important to always look at how movements are limited by their conditions and by their internal composition. There's tons of factors, I would say, here. Yeah, I mean, I think what made the movement so special was its timing. In terms of the hotness of the years that were occurring, the extreme weather, the IPCC reports, the books that were being written. It kind of a perfect combination for this campaign, and it allowed youth to speak and be heard by adults, mostly by shaming them, right, for not doing anything. And I think the goal of that, one of the main goals, was to spread awareness, right, spread knowledge. And I think that was both the benefit but also the problem of the movement, because this idea that spreading awareness and listening to the science should be the goal of the movement, I think is dangerous, because it allows for anyone to just come in with their own solutions and say, yes, I've listened to the movement, and now I'm going to continue doing this policy of supporting carbon taxes or carbon credits, or trying to slowly, change cars into electric. It allows for anyone to come in with any solution they want. And I think that listening to or climate awareness, we now know, is not enough, right? There's been awareness for, since 1988 in the States, since Al Gore's big movie campaign in 2006, since scientists in the 50s. Awareness denialism, I think, is no longer the main enemy of today. Today, I would say it's solutionism. It's the plethora of false solutions that have to be contended with. And I think that would be the next step, right? Instead of asking for people to become aware, it would be to critically engage with the kinds of solutions that are being proposed at the political, business, and technological level, and to show why they are limited, why they're usually economic based damage models, in which they say, okay, here's how much damage we can have in society, so that it doesn't hurt the GDP too much, the national gross product. And I think that's a problem, right? That's a framework problem that needs to be challenged. It shouldn't be an economic question how much heating should be allowed in the world. That should be a human question, a moral question.
Right.
Challenge that requires, different frameworks, different vocabulary than listen and act. It requires more specific content.
Right. Yeah, I mean, before we get into sort of what we could and should do at this moment, perhaps in retrospect first, so just to unpack a little bit more, you have, of course, as you mentioned, a lot of different movements that emerged in this specific historical conjuncture, but you also have the youth climate strike movement, which in many ways achieves what veteran climate justice campaigners have been unable to do in decades, which is really create a mass movement in the name of climate justice, but of course also, as you mentioned, primarily successful in mobilizing these people in terms of awareness raising, and not really successful in its proclaimed goal, that is to force states to pursue policies in line with the Paris Agreement. So how do you think this movement was then absorbed into these kind of false solutionist narratives, or how do you think also that the movement interact with these larger power structures that you touched upon briefly?
Yeah. I mean, we have to remember this is mostly high school kids, right? This is the youth movement, so you can't put such high expectations on people that are really just getting an education and becoming not even workers, right? Not even like seen as contributing value to the society. We can't put the expectations of changing the global economy on them. It's really kind of a shame that or a scandal that it took masses of youth to create something like a mass mobilization around climate change. It's kind of a scandal, I would say. So I don't think it's the fault of students at all. It's the fault of everyone who has been trying to work on this issue for a while, and the fault of society that kind of ignores it. So why didn't this? There's a lot of questions you said, like why didn't this immediately affect states dropping their or creating more policies? Well, I mean, going to a demo doesn't really affect your CO2 emissions, right? Not directly. Right? So if the theory is that climate change, if your theory is that climate change is a result of a million billion small choices every day, and that those choices can be changed via awareness of the issue, then I think that this demo proves that theory is wrong, right? Because if everyone was aware, right, if the millions of people involved were aware, then they would change their behavior and the emissions would drop. But that's not what the climate crisis is, right? It's not the result of millions of small choices every day. That puts the blame on everyone, right? That puts the blame on all of us that are constructing this damage, this harm, right? And it's not everyone's fault, right? That's just a lie. That's a myth that's being taught to everyone to, I would say, diffuse responsibility and spread it away from those actors who have an incentive and make a profit on harming the planet, right? That it's a business plan, right? To burn as much coal as possible, to mine as much minerals as possible, to release as much natural gas, to do it irrespectively, of what's right or wrong. Those are the companies and the practices that need to be challenged. And politicians are not going to do that unless they're not going to do that on their own, because they don't want to drop the growth of their countries, right? That would be a disaster for the politicians. So there's a big structural issue here of how do you even get politicians to go against their own interests, which are usually, keeping the economy doing well. So I think this shows us the problem is bigger than behavioral choices, and it would take turning mass mobilizations into some kind of strategic power force that politicians or businesses or would have to listen to. Why would they listen? Why would they change their behaviors of their companies or of their countries, of their laws, just based on good values, right? It takes more than that, is what I'm trying to say. Even if the CEO of an airline starts driving a hybrid every day because they solve the climate change protests, and that's not going to affect the jet fuel for the airplanes at all. Like, that's a business decision. So on the one hand, like, that would seem the task of the goal of the climate strikes movements. If that was the goal, then it failed. But that, I don't think, is really the goal, right? That's not, you can't put that burden on these people. I mean, one of the things it did is it created a subject, right? It didn't just try to convince people that this is like an issue. People who are waiting there ready. These movements, these strikes, they create different kinds of subjects in the world. They bring people into new modes of relating to themselves and each other, so that they can really integrate these questions into a new life plan, and they can act on it in the future. So the effects of these climate strikes and these climate demos, I think, are more long-term. We'll see them in the next decade. And to look for kind of a short-term fix is just the wrong lens, right? So I would say it's not in their objective effects, it's in their subjective results that really the climate strikes will have a difference. Right. But those effects will be slow and occur over the next 5-10 years. And we'll see, when they're confronted with realism, right? The realism of a state who has to manage its economy, or who has to manage its populations, its constituencies, the realism of businesses, which have to answer to shareholders, faced against demands to voluntarily change their energy sources. Then we'll get to the question of, okay, what next? Right. I think that's when the question becomes a bit more interesting and controversial.
Yeah. And perhaps one way to think about it, what I'm trying to do a lot in this project, is to think about the term of the climate strike itself, because apart from creating this subject, of course, and sort of, the youth or the future generations arising as a sort of autonomous political agent in the context of these protests, they also established the climate strike as a central form of action. And of course, in their name, they allude to a longer tradition of different kinds of strikes, like labor strikes, feminist strikes, and so on. Of course, the climate strike, unlike other kinds of strike, doesn't necessarily directly intervene in the sphere of production, as you mentioned, but it does sort of significantly intervene in some areas of social reproduction. It definitely chooses the school as a site, for instance, in the case of school walkout, and I guess also many families of students and so on will inevitably have to discuss what their kids are doing. So how do you think about this term of the climate strike, and how do you think we could think about it also moving forward, perhaps widening its meaning or not?
So let me go step by step. I think a climate strike, to me, what does it mean? It's a mass action of mostly students, not college students, really. It's a big difference. I think high school students and younger, who want to raise awareness to their governments and to civil society to act on climate change, right? Now, what makes it different than just like, a protest, which high school students and youth have been doing for a long time, which I've done before, is I think it's regularity, right? So it's not a one-day action. It's not a call to action for an event, which has been done so many times before for different social justice campaigns, environmental campaigns, an Earth Day, a day of action against the G8, or against some kinds of against the summits. the climate strike had this kind of regularity to it, this weekly rhythm, which punctuated the year every week, and it still goes on, right? And I think that gives it a different kind of qualitative meaning. It's something that is ongoing. It's not solved by like one event. It continues as you age, right? It grows up with you, and you see people grow up with it. You could join in any week you want. The people who started it are not the people that continue it anymore, right? Because they age out of that sector usually, or they continue into different kinds of groups. It can spread anywhere, right? All that's needed is kind of a similar time, which is usually Fridays. And it can escalate over time. It can de-escalate over time. So the temporality of the climate strike makes it a bit more interesting than other kinds of, I think, actions that usually just have a date, a place in a day, you know, like a May Day demo or something. But technically, you know, you're right. It's not a strike, right? It's not a strike in the technical sense of a withdrawal of labor from the point of production to gain on demands, usually for something immediate to your immediate self-interest, like wage increases or work autonomy. But it does call on these other traditions, like the women's strike, which was a big deal a couple of years before the climate strikes, which was when women were all over North and South America coming out as women in masses, usually against sexist or misogynistic laws or policies, whether anti-abortion or against sexual harassment in the workplace. And they also call that a strike, right? And I think the climate strike is more in this line of it's a social movement that tries to take on the idea of a labor strike and the power of labor strike, but you know, outside the point of production. And I think on the one hand, you have to realize that you have to understand that it is not a strike, because a labor strike really has power to affect concrete owners, right? Who are dependent on those workers. And the students, right? They're not really striking from school. They're walking out, or you could call it even a boycott, right? Because if the school is the commodity and the teachers are actually the workers being paid a wage, then the students are the consumers. So when the consumers don't buy a commodity, they're boycotting it. So it's more of like a boycott, but a boycott has a different significance, a different moral significance. And it's seen as kind of a consumer-based product that doesn't have the same relevance as a strike in the long history. So it makes sense to not call it a boycott, even though it's kind of like a boycott. And yet, you know, I think you shouldn't really give up the strike name, even though it's not necessarily a strike, because there is another tradition of strikes that is similar to this. And here I would reference Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg had this idea from early 1900s of what she called the mass strike. The mass strike, which she developed in her writings against Bernstein and other members of the Social Democratic Party of Germany at that time, was different than just workplace strikes. It was different than even a general strike of many workplaces for a unique cause. The mass strike was her way of understanding the Russian Revolution of 1905. The mass strike was Rosa Luxemburg's way of understanding kind of all the kinds of political and social activities that occur inside and outside the workplace in a revolutionary moment that are kind of the background volatility for what she called the proletariat to really act. So not just the strike at the workplace, but different walkouts, different campaigns against politicians, different actions around prisons, for reducing bread prices, sailors going on strike here, women demanding higher wages here. All this kind of general activity, both inside and outside of unions, both as workers, but also as women or as immigrants or as citizens. All this kind of general background activity, she calls it's the mass strike, right? That's the strike of the masses. And in that mass strike, revolutionary moments can occur, radical moments can break through. And the mass strike is not something, according to Luxemburg, that you can just plan or not plan, right? You plan events, you plan activities, but the mass strike is kind of the the nexus or the matrix in which all these activities work together and how they erupt, right? It's the general volatility of a certain moment. And I think what I'm trying to say is that the climate strike, the women's strike, and all the other activities, they can be seen more in the language of this mass strike activity, right? This idea of this background condition of volatility upon which other more general actions can occur, more specific concrete struggles over pipelines, over energy workers, in universities over divestment. So special campaigns can occur in this general background condition. And maybe even I could read a quote from Luxemburg here that would make sense of it,
Sure.
if you mind. So Luxemburg says, the mass strike is such a changeable phenomenon that it reflects all phases of the political and economic struggle, all stages and factors of the revolution. Its adaptability, its efficiency, the factors of its origin are constantly changing. It suddenly opens new and wide perspectives of the revolution when it appears to have already arrived in a narrow pass and where it is impossible for anyone to reckon upon it with any degree of certainty. It flows now like a broad billow over the whole kingdom, and now divides into a gigantic network of narrow streams. Now it bubbles forth from under the ground like a fresh spring, and now is completely lost under the earth. Political and economic strikes, mass strikes and partial strikes, demonstrative strikes and fighting strikes, general strikes of individual branches of industry, and general strikes in individual towns, peaceful wage struggles and street massacres, barricade fighting, all these run through one another, run side by side, cross one another, flow in and over one another. It is ceaselessly moving, a changing sea of phenomena. And the law of motion for these phenomena is clear. It does not lie in the mass strike itself, nor in its technical details, but in the political and social proportions of the forces of the revolution.
Great.
So that's Luxemburg. That's Luxemburg describing this flow of activity, this lava of revolution. And although we're not in a revolutionary moment, I like to think of climate strikes as a small part of this idea of the mass strike.
Great. So the climate strike as a Luxembourgian mass strike, or at least as one element.
Yes.
And of course, if that's our understanding, then the last 2 years have been rather depressing, in the sense that, of course, after the big mobilizations of 2019, the movement essentially went into quarantine in 2020, but it did have some interesting moments of introspection, of course, during that period. So yeah, like, of course, the pandemic is not over, but, coming out of the pandemic and sort of these 2 moments of first mass mobilization and then introspection, yeah, where do you think is the climate movement headed at the moment, and where should it be headed?
Yeah, I think it's too bad that the climate strikes took such a big step backwards in 2020 and 2021. I mean, there's so much momentum, so much energy in 2019 around climate, and it looked like things were, going to be done, and people were listening. And the pandemic came, and everyone just stopped, right? And people didn't know what to do. It was a new situation for many. People were scared, didn't know whether we should go outside or stay indoors. But it seems like it was, in the end, maybe a strategic mistake to stay indoors, right? As we saw in the middle of 2020, even with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, you can still mobilize millions of people in the streets if you had to. So that was too bad. I think that moment is now, in a sense, that moment is lost. It's not the last moment. It's not the last, wave in the mass strike, but that era is now over. And although there will be climate strikes in the future, and they're still ongoing today, I think that general mobilization is gone, and it'll transform into something else next. As we see, although CO2 emissions took a big hit in 2020 following the lockdowns, they rebounded very strongly in the next years, even higher than before. Coal has been making a comeback. Although there are new targets and voluntary binding goals for different countries and different states, they are woefully inadequate. And it seems likely that businessmen and politicians and CEOs are going to try to do anything but to change the social relations, right? I think geoengineering will be tried, market-based solutions will be tried, anything to keep our mode of life the same, which is very dangerous and very sad for the future of our planet. Now, so if anything, right, the urgency is even more now than before, but I'm not sure the climate strikes will return at the level, right? I think it's good to have moments of reflection. In a sense, after every wave of struggle, there's always a moment of reflection, what went wrong, what went right, and how to carry forward. It's very important to write during these times and to theorize and to not be afraid to critically reflect on one's own activities, to step away really from the front line and to question one's goals. There were some interesting debates in the last 2 years over strategy, over the focus on nonviolence versus direct action and disruption of the economy. Groups like Extinction Rebellion and Enigalanda have also made quite an impact in terms of debating and thinking about these things, and there'll be many groups in the future that arise to really start not just raising awareness, but disrupting, I think, normal behavior, normal business as usual. And I think that this can be both effective and counterproductive if it's not contextualized in the right way, right? So when workers at coal plants or workers or transport workers are being stopped and blockaded, right? I think it's justified to blockade coal plants and to blockade transport for their causing the crisis, but the workers are the ones who are not to blame at all, right? It's the owners. And the consumers are not to blame at all either, I think, not so much, but proportionally, right? It's the owners. So, and the workers play a key role in any transition, right? So what would it mean to incorporate workers, right? To make not just a climate strike, but a labor strike. That to me is really the goal, right? To somehow incorporate, workers in these industries, and to say that this is not just like an issue that needs to be cared about, like a moral question. It's also in your interest to really take control over how society is transforming, because you too will be out of work, right? You too will be transitioned away from, right? In a sense. So it makes sense for people involved in these industries to get involved and to take a say. And can the climate strike break through? The climate movements have been traditionally very middle class, based around professional sectors, NGOs, academics, and not really speaking to the masses of workers who reproduce and produce the world. And I think in any future that wants to be sustainable, that group of people has to be not just brought in as a voice, but made central.
Right. So perhaps get back from the climate strike to the labor strike, or strike together.
The mass strike.
Mass strike. As a strategic and even tactical perspective, I guess, for the movement. That would be a very nice way to end this interview. But I do want to ask you one more thing. In your essay on climate barbarism, you also at times do not sound so optimistic, and you warn also that the movement has spent a lot of time sort of deconstructing and pointing to the contradictions of green capitalism, but that in many political contexts, maybe something far more dangerous may be emerging, namely some kind of climate barbarism. So maybe you could just explain a little bit more about this, and also what implications would this perspective have for the praxis of the movement? Sure.
So many people think that what's going to happen in the future is the G8, and transnational corporations are going to get together to solve the climate, to manage the climate crisis through green investments, new technologies, central bank planning, more treaties, and they'll do it in an unequal way, but a way that slowly brings us in line with maybe 2 degrees of warming. Who knows? I think that's very hopeful. I'm very optimistic. I'm not sure if such negotiation or such levels of action will occur without resistance from those who are dependent on those fossil fuel profits. It's also very likely that the climate crisis gets refracted and mediated through political questions, and it doesn't become a climate question anymore. People are not going to be struggling over, should we do this to stop to lower carbon emissions. They'll be fighting over their means of life. Like, how dare you limit my ability to use nitrogen for my farms for some climate policy, when if I need these farms to make money, right? Which is what we're seeing in the Netherlands right now. And that can take very reactionary perspectives, very populist perspectives, in which you blame kind of global elites for forcing this policy on farmers or on workers. And that can take a very reactionary perspective, in which, we need to get these elites, these internationals, these others out of our community, out of our society, return to kind of national sovereignty, which we determine our policies and our, and who rules here. And we do that in line with our values. And our values can be, nationalistic values, values of masculinity, values of traditional labor, of good jobs. And that's very likely, right? This kind of, instead of this expanding, globalized solution of the climate crisis, this retracting, regressive narrowing of the national community to different like ethno-nationalist bases, which offset the climate crisis onto immigrants, right, or foreign agents, usually coded as Jews, or Muslims or others, or just foreigners who are taking the shrinking resources due to the reality of climate change, right? So these perspectives wouldn't deny climate change; they would accept it, but just displace the cause onto others, and to call for solutions that are strengthening borders and strengthening strengthening the division of resources amongst those who deserve it and those who don't, right? So this is a policy, this is a framework in which accepts climate change. It accepts that it's happening. It doesn't really think that it can be stopped, but it adapts to it. It adapts to it in a way that's very cruel and reactionary. And this can use very devious language. It can use language of localism. It can use the language of justice, right? It's a question of justice. It's a question of our locality. It can use the language of community. It can use the language even of decolonization, right? Decolonization. You can use the language of liberation. And this is I think this is the way that barbarism and comes into the world, right? And eco-fascism comes into the world. It comes into the world looking like liberation, looking like justice. And we have to be aware of that in the future as a realistic possibility. And I think it makes sense to just look at that from a sober perspective and analyze that, and to think about questioning those kinds of values when they get brought up, questioning frameworks, nationalistic frameworks that align with these models, whether left or right, to ward off against this possible solution. To really think about more global solidarity-based frameworks, solidarity again across classes, across ethnic, national, racial, religious boundaries that do not reify, masculinist, hetero, patriarchal, racial, white supremacist frameworks of what it means to be a citizen, but instead looks at how do we care and repair this world as humans, part of a non-human nature. In which we are one small part in a long, long trajectory.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Feel free to check out the other episodes as well. And I hope you have a great day wherever you are.